Hi, everyone. Welcome. I am Emily Hovermale, the Director of Government Affairs for the Humane Rescue Alliance. And I'm happy to be joined here today with Chris Schindler, our Vice President of Field Services, to talk about our priority legislative initiative in front of the DC Council, the Animal Care and Control Omnibus Amendment Act. Many of you may know that we had a community conversation with our legislative champion, Councilmember Mary Che, toward the end of 2020. And the Animal Care and Control Omnibus Act was the focus of an advocacy training event last year. A lot has happened, thankfully, since then, and we wanted to update you about the bill's progress and talk a little bit about why this is such a historic and important piece of animal welfare legislation. So I'm going to really briefly go through what's included in the legislation because it is a huge package of 7 important animal welfare reforms. And then Chris and I will have a conversation about the real life applications of some of these provisions for our humane law enforcement. And then, of course, we'll have time for questions. So if you have any questions that come into your mind during the presentation or at any point, please feel free to put those in the Q&A, and we will address them during that part of the event. So I'm going to share my screen here really quickly to go through, as I mentioned, these different provisions. So we will hope that it decides to start the slideshow. Okay. Oh, it's going of its own accord. All right. So as I mentioned, the Animal Care and Control Omnibus Amendment Act, this is legislation that was reintroduced really in December of last year by Council members Mary Che, Brienne Nadeau, Charles Allen, Janice Lewis George, and Brooke Pinto. And as I mentioned, it makes 7 important changes pertaining to domestic animals and animal control operations. So I'm going to go through these really quickly because Chris and I are going to get into more in the conversation. So the provisions are banning implements of dogfighting. So this bans the specific tools that are used to train and facilitate dogfighting because it's not uncommon for law enforcement officers to investigate a site of suspected dogfighting only to find the implements of dogfighting are present on the property, but them dogs and themselves are not. So this is closing a loophole in current dogfighting laws to specifically ban possession of these implements that are used for training and facilitating dogfighting. The second provision authorizes emergency vehicles for animal control. So this bill addresses the need of a faster response time in cases of life-threatening emergencies involving an animal by authorizing our animal control vehicles to operate emergency lights and sirens when they are responding to life-threatening animal-related emergencies. There's also, oops, I keep going a little too far. A little click happy, sorry about that. The bonding for care of seized animals. So this provision allows our humane law enforcement to recover the costs incurred when carrying and boarding seized animals during the pendency of criminal proceedings. I think that when there's often some questions about, so Chris and I will definitely get into a little bit more about what that means. Eliminating the loophole on sexual contact with animals. Strangely enough, bestiality remains legal in the District of Columbia, along with just 4 other states. So as other states have acted to close this loophole and pass anti-sexual abuse laws pertaining to animals, this bill will do similarly and prohibit sexual contact between a person and an animal, including the advertisement, offer of sale, or dissemination of photographs or video footage of sexual contact between a person and animal. Almost there. So we've got the requiring pet stores to source rescued animals. The bill will prohibit a pet store operator from selling cats, dogs, and aquatic turtles in a pet store unless the animal was obtained from a humane society, shelter, or rescue group. The aquatic turtles component is something that is fairly unique to our legislation and is directly related to an issue that we see in the district with the easy acquisition of pet turtles from retail establishments that ultimately end up at our shelter when they grow large or when people don't realize upon purchasing them that they may live to be 20 years old or older. There's also an issue with them being released into the wild, which is why our partner, City Wildlife, is also very supportive of this provision because of the threat that these non-native aquatic turtles pose to native wildlife whenever they are released. So it's a little bit of a twist on a traditional pet store sales legislation directly tailored to the issues we see here in DC. Prohibiting non-therapeutic cat declawing. For those who may not be aware of what a cat declawing procedure is, it does actually involve an amputation, the removal of the first bone of the toe, which is roughly comparable to the removal of the human fingertip at the first knuckle. So this is a highly invasive and painful procedure that can lead to a lot of long-term negative effects for the cat. And this legislation prohibits the elective performance of declawing with exceptions for medical necessity. For those who are particularly excited about this component, you may know that our neighbor to the north, Maryland, is very much in the process of passing their own Declaw Prohibition. It has passed both the Senate and the House and the state legislature. And so very soon we will have even more precedent for prohibiting non-therapeutic declawing of cats. And the final component is managing pet ownership in a divorce. So currently, family pets are treated as pure property when a couple separates, divorces, terminates a domestic partnership, or has an annulment. And the bill modifies this pure property disposition so that the court may assign sole or joint ownership of a pet based on the care and what is in the best interest of the animal, rather than just basing it on essentially who can prove that they have paid for the animal in some way or have been the primary owner of the animal. So in terms of where the legislation is and what's been happening with it, I mentioned that it was introduced in December and it actually just had a hearing before the DC Council's Committee on Judiciary and Public Safety at the end of February. So we are waiting further action at this point. It's a very good sign to have a hearing, but the committee still has to mark up the bill and move it out of the committee in order for it to advance and come for a full council vote. So we'll talk a little bit more about this, but essentially the big ask for you all, which you can do to help us see this historic landmark animal welfare legislation pass in DC, is to voice your support to your ward and at-large DC Council members, and especially if they serve on the Judiciary and Public Safety Committee. The DC Council website makes it very easy to find who your elected representatives are. You just go to the DC Council main website, the main page, the homepage, scroll down to about halfway down, and you'll see that there is a location to put in your address, and they will tell you who your ward representative is. So with that, this is just my information and I'll put that back up later, but I wanted to stop recording potentially, or stop sharing rather, and get into a little bit more of a conversation with Chris about what some of these provisions mean, and especially what they mean in terms of our humane law enforcement. So Chris, many people probably don't realize that when an animal is seized due to suspected cruelty in the district, they're still legally owned by their alleged abuser until the final outcome of the criminal trial, which can often take months or even years. And this is what the cost of care, the bonding component, really gets at this issue. During the hearing on the 28th, you testified and you mentioned a case where HRA humane law enforcement officers seized 13 dogs and puppies from an alleged dogfighting operation in July of 2018. And so we have had these animals in our care for over 3 years. Can you talk a little bit more about that case? And is it normal for animals to have to be in our care for this long when they've been rescued from an abusive situation?
Yeah, of course. I mean, this is why this legislation is so critically important is, unfortunately, due to delays in the criminal justice system, right, we have no control over length of time for trials and things of that nature. And with COVID, that added an additional element. This issue obviously pre-existed considering the age of that case. And so we're still awaiting trial currently. And so those dogs remain in care pending the outcome of any criminal proceedings, which hopefully should be this year. But that's just one of many cases. And, with every case that we do, there is the potential that animals could have to be held for, 6 months to a year, or in some cases, years.
How many animals do we currently have on hold awaiting their owner's criminal trial?
Currently, we have,
Approximately.
yeah, I mean, currently we have a little over 100 animals on humane hold, because we had some larger scale cases that had large numbers of animals. And many of those have been with us for at least a year at this point.
Wow. So what is the impact of holding animals for that length of time? What's the impact on our organization, on the animals? I mean, that number is humongous. And to consider holding that number of animals for that extended period of time, I can just imagine how many resources go into that.
Yeah, I mean, even one animal in care for a long period of time requires a significant amount of resources, especially when you're talking about long-term care that requires long-term medical care, behavior-related work, or animal caretakers. I mean, there's a number of people that have to be involved. And so then when we have these cases where there's large numbers of animals, especially, where we end up with over 100 animals for more than a year, I mean, that creates a significant issue, not only for space-related issues and things like that, but certainly this is the work that we're committed to, so we're always going to find a way to do the work. We're never going to not rescue an animal in need, but this is why we need legislation that, one, gives due process to somebody at the front end to have a hearing, and so that some of these issues can be resolved at the beginning of the case and not waiting until after a trial.
Right. And can you explain a little bit more, you just touched on it, but about how the legislation does seek to address this issue and help all of these animals that are currently forced to be held in this legal limbo, essentially still owned by their alleged abusers, but in our custodial care for years. Like, how does the legislation address it? Explain a little bit more if you can.
Yeah, of course. Just for a brief on what happens right now is there is a hearing process technically right now, but that hearing process, if there's criminal charges filed, gets stayed. And so somebody does have the ability to have a hearing, but only if criminal charges are not being pursued. As soon as criminal charges are being pursued, they lose their ability to a hearing until after that case has been heard. This new legislation will give the ability for that hearing to happen immediately. So there would be a hearing immediately that then would determine the cost of care for 30-day periods, and that the individual would have the ability, always has the ability, to surrender their animals, but if they would like to pay the cost of care, they can pay that every 30 days until the case is heard.
Which seems to me, I mean, and I know that this is a process that 38 states already have in the law, and it seems to me it just makes logical sense, right? Because these animals are still legally owned by these individuals. And if they wish to continue maintaining their ownership rights over the animals, then they have to provide them care. I mean, currently they have to provide them care under the law if they are in their custody. And then whenever we seize them, because they must be seized to protect them from harm, it shouldn't obfuscate the owner from their responsibility to take care of that animal that they own.
Yeah, of course. I mean, somebody is already required by law to provide medical care or veterinary care, to provide daily care, proper housing, and things of that nature. And so this is really, recouping the cost that somebody should be paying at home, except now there's been an alleged crime committed and the animal has to remain in our care while that's heard. And I think it's perfectly reasonable, especially as you stated, considering so many other states have adopted these types of statutes to be able to deal with this issue as well.
Right, because there's also the recognition that, when you seize animals, it can't be treated like just any kind of seized property. If you seize property, you can lock it in a storage container and not touch it until the criminal trial, even if it's ultimately a year away. But these animals are living, breathing, feeling creatures who need care, behavior treatment, medical treatment. And of course, all of that is costs money. So Yeah, exactly. The 2018 case that we were talking about relates to dogfighting, and there's a provision in the bill that is also about dogfighting that relates to ownership of these implements. From your experience, and I know you have a great deal of experience in dogfighting, I think you're considered a national expert on dogfighting. Can you talk a little bit more about why it's necessary to prohibit the ownership of these implements used for the training of dogfighting when dogfighting is already illegal?
Yeah, of course. I think there's a lot sometimes that's misunderstood about dogfighting and how it's such an extraordinarily organized crime, right? Where people travel all over the country, people sell dogs and trade implements and things like that all over the country. And so as we've done more cases, right, there's been a significant amount of attention on dogfighting and more cases happen. These individuals become more, clever in how they try to hide and evade detection from law enforcement. And so it's not inoften that you may have somewhere where dogs are being conditioned, right? They're being prepared for a fight, but not being fought. And you may have those types of implements. Or there might be a location where dogs are being brought to be conditioned, but there are not dogs housed there. And so this new legislation would give us the ability to be able to further our investigations into organized dogfighting, because it is here. We do have it. We've done a number of cases. We're always working on these types of cases here. But there's a loophole, right, for some of these activities that we need to close so that we're not a haven for dogfighting.
Right. And I can see too how if a number of our neighboring states have this existing prohibition as they do, that it could make a place like DC that doesn't have this kind of loophole closed seem more attractive to dogfighters. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. What about some of the other provisions of the bill in terms of our humane law enforcement officers having the tools they need to protect animals in the community and olive field services, like the lights and sirens for animal control vehicles? Can you put that into context a little bit more about the types of issues that we're talking about, why the need for something like lights and sirens for animal control vehicles?
Yeah, of course. Our officers are first responders. They respond to emergencies, not only just for animals, but also where humans are involved every day of the year, right? And so they're often responding to these things. But the issue comes is if there's a really, serious, somebody's being attacked by a dog, for example, we don't have the ability to right now to bypass traffic. And so there's going to be delays in our ability to reach somebody to provide assistance, because anyone who's driven through the city knows, depending on the time or what's going on, you could get extremely delayed or not be able to make it at all to where you're going. And so we really need our officers to be able to make it to these situations, because we're also assisting Metropolitan Police and fire and EMS when there's somebody with a medical emergency who has an animal that they can't reach the person because the animal's protecting them. And so there's a lot of, human safety related issues. In addition to our want to protect animals, we also are here to be able to help people. And we can't do that unless we can make it to you.
Yes, that absolutely makes sense, especially because the animal control officers are obviously trained in dealing with heightened situations with animals. And I could see that it would obviously be beneficial in these kind of multi-unit responses to have somebody from animal control who knows how to safely and appropriately deal with an animal threat versus, having another member of the response team kind of involved in that who doesn't have that expertise.
Exactly.
Right. And then in terms of the animal sexual contact provision, I know that many in our community probably remember in August 2020 when we had a couple of very disturbing, very sad animal sexual abuse cases involving young animals within a very short period of time of each other. So obviously it is tragic and unfortunate, but this is something that does take place in the district. But can you talk a little bit more about why a specific prohibition against bestiality, against sexual contact with an animal is so essential, given existing prohibitions against animal cruelty, why this kind of special provision is necessary.
Yeah, I mean, of course, this is a topic I know nobody likes to talk about. I don't really
Right.
like to talk about it either, but that's I
Yeah.
think part of the issue, right? Is that if we don't discuss it, we end up with loopholes in laws and in our
Mm.
inability to pursue these cases. And one of the important pieces to know about this type of crime is that this isn't necessarily always somebody just like isolated individuals. This
Mm.
is another form of an organized crime against animals, where people buy and sell and trade animals and share videos that they create and things like that and meet up. And we have that issue here. I think
Mm.
sometimes people don't realize that these things happen. Doesn't matter whether you're in a rural area or a major city or what part of the country, it exists
Right.
everywhere. And I've worked heavily on this issue. And the other, prong to this is that often there's an element of child sexual related offenses
Mm.
that are incorporated with animal sexual abuse. And most of those types of crimes are much more hidden than the animal sexual abuse related crimes. And using these cases, oftentimes you're going to find evidence on individuals who are harming children as well. And so we should all want to not only take people off the streets who are hurting animals in this way, but certainly if that's a avenue in which to address some of these individuals that are moving on to humans, then I think we would all be in support of doing that.
Yes, I've read that the research supports that assertion that one of the greatest indicators of whether someone will sexually abuse a child is whether they have engaged in animal sexual abuse. So I can understand how cracking down on this kind of predation against a vulnerable population of animals will be beneficial to keeping the community safe as well as animals. So I think that's really good context to have in mind. And the fact that the legislation also goes so far as to ban, the distribution of these videos and materials, I think is important to the point you said of this is folks who are engaged in this are often engaged in a network of sharing and distributing this information as well, which is highly disturbing. And as you said, a highly unpleasant topic, but one that ultimately, when you look at the fact that DC is in such a minority of not having a prohibition against this type of activity, you see, okay, this is something that we really do need to change.
Exactly.
Yeah. So Lauren, I don't know if there are any questions from the participants, but I think it would be a great time to see if anyone had any questions about other provisions of the bill or about anything that Chris and I talked about in terms of the implications for law enforcement. And I can also put the slide back with the information on contacting counsel if that would be helpful.
Hi, Emily. Yes. So we have a question about, we are in a unique position in DC that we're surrounded by Maryland and Virginia, and very close to those two states. There was one question about that, just to clarify that this legislation only pertains to the district. And in that case, do you know of anything that's going on in Maryland and Virginia that also supports kind of these same legislation for animal welfare?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. So this is legislation that's pending before the DC Council. So it does only impact Washington, DC. And, we are working on this for a number of reasons, but primarily because we are the enforcement agency for animal cruelty crimes in the District of Columbia. So Chris and his team are in the unique position of being able to see exactly where the deficiencies in the law currently are in terms of our ability to keep animals in the community safe in DC. And so that is the focus of this legislation. I think that it is great that there is some progress on similar issues in our surrounding areas. Maryland actually has been working on a cost of care bonding provision for quite some time. And just this year. They are currently in session as well. The bill has made it fully through one chamber and is into the Senate. It's fully through the House and is into the Senate, and hopefully that will continue to progress before they adjourn. So I think that that is helpful in terms of moving the ball forward on this issue. Like we mentioned, most states do already have this in place. Virginia is one that does already have that law in place, as does West Virginia. So I think having Maryland and DC potentially enacting similar legislation on this issue in the same year will be really beneficial to kind of moving this whole initiative forward and getting our whole region in line with the way that we should be treating animals upon seizure. I think I also mentioned, it's not one that we had a larger conversation about, but the Declaw Prohibition, the prohibition on non-therapeutic declawing of cats, is also one that is really advancing very quickly in Maryland, and has already, the companion legislation has passed each chamber. So it is really just a matter of time before that fully passes and goes to the governor for signature. So Maryland is very much on track to become the second state in the country to prohibit declawing. And I think that it's very timely for DC to be taking this up and looking at this as well. You know, we all know that the borders and the lines between Maryland, DC, and Virginia are very fluid. So a lot of people who have pets may take their cats to Maryland for treatment, depending on where they live. And so it'll be good if we are a unified force with some of this stuff. And of course, Maryland has already passed pet retail sales restrictions as well. So I think in a lot of ways we are right in step with our neighbors in terms of a lot of the legislation that we're working on. It's a good question.
That's great. Thank you, Emily. There's another question because we have a location in St. Hubert's Animal Welfare Center. So there's another question about any kind of regulations in New Jersey as well.
Yes. So I guess the theme of this is turning into a cost of care presentation, because we are very focused on passing cost of care legislation in New Jersey as well. This is part of a nice coalition that we're working with the Animal Legal Defense Fund and the ASPCA and HSUS and a lot of local animal shelters to pass a similar cost of care legislation in New Jersey. Excitingly, that bill this session has already fully passed the Senate. Similar to us here in DC, New Jersey's legislature meets all year round. So it is quite early in the session for them to have already gotten it fully through the Senate. So that's very exciting. And we are hopeful that the Assembly will take up the bill for a hearing when the legislature comes back from their break to work on the budget. So there's kind of no current activity beyond that happening in New Jersey. We are also working with some other organizations like People for Animals in New Jersey on legislation to help make it easier to do TNR in the state, the Compassion for Community Cats bill. That one isn't on quite the same fast track, but we are very much excited about the possibility of making TNR more readily accessible and available in New Jersey. So yes, we are doing legislative things in New Jersey as well.
Great, thank you. And then just kind of another question around this caretaker bonds. Whenever animals come into our care because of a humane law enforcement issue, can you talk about, maybe Chris or Emily, can you talk about a process of communicating with that person about, you know, relinquishing ownership? Is there a process that is talked with that person to give options? Kind of just why we get put in the position of having to hold on to these animals through the legislation process.
Yeah, of course. You know, certainly, you know, any owner has the ability to surrender their animal at any point. You know, we can't coerce somebody into surrendering their animal. Certainly, we always discuss with people their options as far as, you know, when an animal seized, there's actually very specific regulations here in the district of the different types of communications that we have to provide. And at any point, someone has the ability not go forward with a hearing, for example, or to relinquish ownership of the animal. So the same will be for this new legislation as well.
Right.
Great, thank you. And if one doesn't, if it goes into, if the bill is passed and it goes into, you know, action after those 30 days, whenever that 30-day period is up, if the person who is responsible to pay the cost of that animal's care does not pay the cost, do you know what that process then would be? Would we then have ownership of the animal at that point?
Yes. So the animal would be forfeited. So if the first bond wasn't paid within the time frame that was required, that was first issued, and then at any point thereafter, right, going months into it, if the individual fails to pay within the timeline, they would forfeit ownership of the animals, and we'd be free to move forward with placement.
Great, thank you. We have another question about, Emily, probably for you, about the timeline for passing any of these laws, what you are expecting maybe for that.
Right, that's a really good question. So as I mentioned, the bill has had its hearing in committee, which is the first major step, getting the bill scheduled for a hearing and having that take place. And then the committee will do what's known as markup, where they will take a look at the legislation and make any kind of tweaks or changes that they need to make before advancing it out of committee and to the full council for consideration. So actually, the same as I just mentioned for New Jersey, the DC Council is in their budget season right now. So they are working almost exclusively on reviewing and making changes and passing the DC budget that was just given to them by the mayor not very long ago. So they're in the process of having hearings for all the agencies and looking through every aspect of the budget with a fine-tooth comb. And so we don't expect that there will be any progress on moving the bill to markup during this period. So we are looking at around the mid-May timeframe of where the markup could potentially take place. And so we'll be pushing for that. And that is another reason why everyone reaching out to their council members is so essential and so important, is just to keep a steady, polite, respectful drumbeat going to the council, to keep this on their radar, to keep them acting on this. Of course, we'll be doing that as well, but it certainly helps to hear from constituents. And that will sort of be the hurdle, is to make sure that there aren't any delays with moving the bill forward. There's an interesting process in DC where after a bill has had its hearing, it can essentially be carried over from one legislative session to the next. So there are times when a bill will have a hearing 1 year and then not be marked up until a couple of years later. We don't want that to happen to our bill, obviously. And so that's why hearing from everyone and kind of keeping it moving forward is so important. We definitely want to have this bill fully passed by the end of this year, and that is what we're shooting for.
Great, thank you. And we have one question for you, Chris, about the cruelty case that happened this week in DC. Do you have an update that you can give on that ongoing investigation?
Yeah, I mean, of course, this is still very much an active investigation, so I can't share specific details. But what I can say is that we are very much so still looking for tips from individuals on the identity of the person or location of the dog. There is a reward of $22,500 that we had issued yesterday from generous donors who were willing to support this reward. And our officers have been working tirelessly, I mean, round the clock, working on this case. But we would ask that anyone in the neighborhood that it occurred, and on our Facebook page, you'll see there's the reward information. I know it's been shared in the media. There's a list of streets. But there's a long list of streets that anyone who has ring doorbell cameras or surveillance cameras, that we're asking for them to check their footage and provide it to us if they have it.
Great, thank you very much. We have one additional question, probably for you, Emily. Do you have any template language that could be used whenever people reach out to their representatives, or pre-written post that they can repost on social media pages?
Yes, yes, we have shared that on social media in the past, but we will do that again so that people can share that information readily. And I'll also send that out to everyone who registered for this webinar, which I think will be really helpful. I'll include in the follow-up information just the very brief sort of template language that you can use when reaching out to your elected officials. It's best in a lot of times not to overly use the same sort of form letter or information, because a lot of times elected officials will note that all of the letters that they have received are essentially the same. They recognize that it's a form letter that has been auto-generated, and not that there's anything wrong with that, but to the extent that anyone can personalize or explain why this bill is so important to them, why it's meaningful, and why it would matter to them to have it passed. These are really the kind of messages and information that makes a difference, especially coming directly from constituents. So great question. And I had noted that I would mention that. And so that's the perfect time for me to say that in the follow-up materials, everyone will have that link to find their elected officials, as well as a little bit of sample language that can be used and hopefully modified and made your own to reach out to your elected officials and ask them to take action on the bill. Good question.
Thank you. Those are all the questions that we have right now. So if you have anything that you want to kind of follow up on, but otherwise, those are all the questions. So thank you both for your time today.
Okay, let me just really quickly put my information back up on the screen so that everyone can see the email if they would like to reach out to me with any additional questions before I reach out to everyone with the additional information following this presentation. So if you have any questions, you want to talk more about how you can get involved, please feel free to reach out to me at advocacy@humanerescuealliance.org. We also have some additional volunteer opportunities for those who may be interested in a little bit of a higher level of advocacy engagement. We call it our Ward Captain program. So if it's something that you're potentially interested in talking with me about how you can be a little bit of an official HRA advocacy volunteer and a little bit more engaged, having meetings with your elected officials and representing yourself as a ward captain for HRA, then this is the email to reach out to me as well. We would definitely love to have more people involved in helping with the advocacy efforts.
Wonderful, thank you. We will also be providing the recording of this presentation on our YouTube channel. So if you want to check back and hear the presentation, or if you want to share it with anyone that was not able to make it today, it will be available on our YouTube channel later. All right. Thank you, Chris. Thank you, Emily. Best of luck in your investigations, ongoing investigations, and this legislation. It's really exciting to learn what we are going to be able to do, hopefully, in the district. So thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thank
Bye,
you.
everyone. Have a great day.
Bye.
Bye.